You? An heiress? That's adorable. The words floated across the glass-walled boardroom, followed by a ripple of restrained laughter that spread from one end of the 12-foot walnut table to the other, the kind of laughter people used when they wanted to stay polite but couldn't resist the spectacle unfolding in front of them. And at the center of that spectacle stood Naomi Carter, 17 years old, dressed in a simple navy cardigan, dark jeans, and white sneakers, her backpack resting quietly at her feet as if she had just walked out of a high school hallway instead of stepping into a multi-billion-dollar corporate meeting in downtown Chicago. While Richard Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, a faint smile curling at the edge of his lips, the confidence of a self-made millionaire radiating from every controlled movement he made. And the room followed his lead because Richard Whitmore was the man rumored to be buying controlling shares of Carter Holdings, the man investors listened to, the man who walked into rooms like he already owned them. And to him, Naomi looked like a misplaced intern or someone's daughter who had wandered into the wrong floor of a skyscraper. Not the quiet figure who had just introduced herself moments earlier with the calm statement that she was there as the company's primary heir, and when she didn't react to the laughter, didn't defend herself, didn't argue. The silence that followed stretched just long enough to make a few people shift in their chairs. Because there was something unsettling about how still she remained, her hands folded lightly in front of her, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, like she had heard this before, like she had expected it. And outside the windows, the Chicago skyline shimmered in the late afternoon light, the sun bouncing off glass towers while inside the room the air conditioning hummed softly, keeping the temperature a steady 72 degrees. Yet the tension felt warmer, heavier, as Richard glanced around the table again, inviting agreement without saying a word, and one of the junior investors chuckled quietly. Another cleared his throat, and someone near the end of the table whispered something under their breath about teenagers and TikTok, and still Naomi didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink as she pulled out a slim folder from her backpack and set it gently on the table. The movement small but deliberate, like someone placing a marker on a chessboard, and Richard watched her with mild amusement, tapping his watch once as if reminding everyone that time was valuable, his voice smooth when he spoke again, telling her that boardrooms weren't places for fantasy claims, that real ownership came with numbers and experience and decades of work. And yet as he spoke, a few members of the board exchanged glances, not because of what he said, but because of the quiet confidence in Naomi's posture, the absence of nerves, the way she seemed anchored to the moment. And somewhere near the far end of the table, a senior analyst leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as if the name Carter had just clicked into place, while the room, once filled with polite laughter, settled into a quieter tension, the kind that forms when people sense that something just shifted but can't yet explain why. And Naomi finally lifted her eyes, meeting Richard's gaze with calm certainty, not defiant, not emotional, just steady. And in that stillness the laughter faded completely, replaced by a silence that felt less like embarrassment and more like anticipation. Because the teenager they had just dismissed didn't look like someone who had made a mistake. She looked like someone waiting for the room to catch up. Richard Whitmore leaned back further into his chair as the silence settled, the faint smile still resting on his face like he had already won a conversation that Naomi had not even joined. And around the table the board members began shifting papers, checking tablets, and glancing at one another with the quiet impatience of executives who believed the interruption had already lasted too long. Yet Naomi remained seated at the far end of the 12-foot table, her posture relaxed, her backpack still resting beside her chair, her presence small but impossible to ignore, and the contrast between her and the room felt almost deliberate. Polished suits, silver watches, leather folders, and then a teenager sitting calmly like she had nowhere else to be, while Richard cleared his throat and adjusted his cufflinks, speaking again in a tone that sounded polite but carried a thin layer of dismissal, explaining that the board meeting was about strategic restructuring, not imaginative claims, and that if Naomi had come to observe, she was welcome to sit quietly, but ownership discussions required verified stakeholders, and a few members nodded as if the matter was already resolved. Yet Naomi reached into her folder and slid a single sheet forward, not dramatically, just enough for the paper to rest in the center of the polished wood, and though no one moved immediately, The action pulled attention back to her, because it was not defensive, not nervous, it was controlled, and somewhere near the middle of the table. Daniel Reeves, a senior financial advisor in his early 50s, leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing as he tried to read the header on the document from across the table, while Richard watched with mild curiosity, tapping his pen lightly against his leather notebook, and the rhythm echoed faintly in the quiet room. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long reflections across the glass walls, and the city traffic below moved like distant currents, unaware of the tension building 40 stories above. And Naomi finally spoke, her voice steady, not loud, not emotional, simply clear, explaining that she was not there to interrupt, but to confirm voting authority before the meeting continued. And that sentence hung in the air differently than her earlier introduction, because it did not sound like a request. It sounded procedural, like something she had done before, and a few board members exchanged glances again, subtle but noticeable. While Richard raised one eyebrow, the confidence still present, but now edged with curiosity, asking her which authority she believed she held. And Naomi met his gaze calmly, her expression unchanged. And for a brief moment Daniel Reeves shifted in his chair, his attention now fully on Naomi, as if he was trying to recall something, a memory just out of reach, because the name Carter had weighed in this room, and the quiet teenager at the end of the table did not behave like someone pretending. She behaved like someone waiting for confirmation, and the air conditioning hummed softly, again, filling the silence that followed, while Naomi reached for her phone, placing it gently beside the document, not dialing yet, just setting it there, and that small motion carried more weight than any raised voice, because it suggested that whatever came next did not depend on convincing anyone in the room, only on timing. And Richard noticed it too, his pen stopping mid-tap as he watched her, the faint smile fading just slightly, replaced by something more measured, while around the table the earlier amusement had dissolved into quiet attention. And for the first time since she entered, Naomi Carter did not look like a teenager in the wrong room. She looked like someone waiting for the room to catch up to her authority. Richard Whitmore straightened in his chair as the quiet tension settled into something heavier. And for the first time since Naomi entered the room, he no longer looked amused. He looked calculating, his fingers resting flat against the polished table as he studied her with the careful attention of someone reassessing a situation that no longer felt predictable. And around the table several board members shifted subtly, their earlier confidence fading into cautious curiosity, while Daniel Reeves leaned further forward, his reading glasses now resting low on his nose as he tried again to see the document Naomi had placed in front of her. And Naomi remained still, her phone resting beside the paper, her posture unchanged, calm and composed, like someone who had no need to rush the moment. And Richard finally broke the silence, his voice controlled but firmer now, asking Naomi what exactly she expected the board to confirm. And Naomi answered without hesitation, explaining that she was requesting verification of controlling voting rights associated with the Carter family trust. And the words landed differently than anything she had said before, because they sounded precise, structured, and familiar to the legal language of the room. And a few board members exchanged glances again, this time less subtle, while Daniel Reeves looked sharply toward the head of the table, where corporate counsel Melissa Grant sat flipping through her digital tablet, her fingers pausing mid-scroll as she searched the company records. And Richard noticed the shift immediately, his jaw tightening just slightly as he leaned forward, his confidence still present, but now edged with caution, while Naomi reached for her phone and unlocked it with a calm motion, not dramatic, not rushed, just deliberate. And she dialed a number without looking down for long, as if she had memorized it years ago. And the quiet ringing tone filled the room, soft but unmistakable, and no one spoke as they watched her, the late afternoon sunlight now fading slightly behind the glass skyline, casting longer shadows across the table. And Naomi spoke when the call connected, her voice steady and professional, asking for confirmation of her voting authority for Carter Holdings. And though the person on the other end could not be heard clearly, Naomi listened briefly, then nodded once, her expression unchanged, while across the table Melissa Grant suddenly stopped scrolling and looked up, her eyes widening slightly as something appeared on her screen. And Daniel Reeves noticed it immediately, his posture stiffening, while Richard followed their reactions. The faint crease forming between his brows as he realized the room was no longer following his lead, and Naomi ended the call quietly, placing her phone back on the table with the same calm motion as before, and the silence that followed felt different now, heavier, like the moment before a storm shifts direction. While Melissa Grant cleared her throat softly, her attention still fixed on her tablet, and Daniel Reeves leaned toward her, whispering something under his breath, and Richard watched them carefully, the confidence in his posture tightening, as the boardroom that had laughed minutes earlier now waited, not for Naomi to explain herself, but for confirmation that was already moving through the system. And Naomi Carter sat quietly at the end of the table, her hands folded again, her gaze steady, like someone who had already seen this moment unfold before. Melissa Grant lifted her head slowly from her tablet, her expression no longer neutral, and the subtle shift did not go unnoticed because in rooms like this, people read silence as carefully as they read numbers, and Daniel Reeves leaned closer to her, his voice low but urgent as he asked if she was seeing what he thought she was seeing, while Melissa nodded once, still scanning the screen, her fingers moving carefully as she opened another document. And across the table Richard Whitmore straightened further, the relaxed confidence he had worn earlier now replaced with measured patience, his eyes moving between them as if trying to anticipate the direction of the conversation before it turned, and Naomi remained still, her calm presence anchoring the room, her gaze resting quietly ahead as if she already understood what was appearing on those screens, and the late afternoon light outside shifted again, the sun dipping lower behind the skyline, casting a warmer tone across the glass walls, while the quiet hum of the building ventilation filled the silence that stretched longer than anyone expected. And finally Melissa cleared her throat gently, her voice professional but edged with something more cautious as she addressed the room, explaining that a verification request had just entered the system under the Carter Family Trust, and the words alone changed the atmosphere, because the Carter Trust was not something casually referenced. It was the foundation of the company itself, and Daniel Reeves leaned back slightly, his expression tightening as he processed what that meant, while Richard tilted his head just slightly, his voice calm as he asked whether the request had been authenticated, and Melissa hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering that the credentials appeared valid and were routed directly through executive verification channels. And that was when the first real silence fell, not awkward, not uncertain, but heavy, like a room realizing it had just crossed an invisible line. And Naomi sat quietly, her hands still folded, her posture unchanged, while one of the junior board members shifted in his seat, glancing at Naomi with a new level of attention, and Daniel Reeves leaned forward again, his eyes now fixed on Naomi, as if connecting pieces that had not fit before, and Melissa continued scrolling, her eyes widening slightly as additional authorization layers appeared on her screen, and she spoke again, more carefully now, explaining that the trust documentation listed a controlling heir with immediate voting authority effective upon verification, and Richard's pen, which had been resting between his fingers, stopped moving completely, his expression tightening just enough to reveal that the conversation had moved beyond amusement, and Naomi finally lifted her eyes slightly, not to challenge anyone, but simply to acknowledge the shift, and across the table Daniel Reeves asked quietly if the system had confirmed the name associated with the trust. And Melissa hesitated again, her fingers hovering above the screen as she prepared to answer, while the room leaned into the silence. Every person now focused not on Naomi as an interruption, but on Naomi as a possibility, and the calm teenager at the end of the table remained still, like someone who had already lived this moment before and was simply waiting for the room to catch up. Melissa Grant inhaled quietly as her eyes moved across the screen, and the hesitation before she spoke stretched long enough for everyone in the room to feel it, while Daniel Reeves leaned forward slightly, his voice low but steady as he asked her to confirm the name listed under the trust, and Melissa nodded slowly, her tone measured as she read aloud that the Carter Family Trust designated Naomi Carter as the controlling heir with immediate voting authority, and the words landed softly, but carried weight that shifted the air in the room, while Richard Whitmore remained still, his posture tightening as he processed the information, his gaze fixed on Naomi with a new level of scrutiny. And around the table several board members exchanged glances, the earlier skepticism dissolving into quiet realization. While Naomi did not react dramatically, she simply remained seated, calm and composed, her expression unchanged as if the confirmation was not surprising but expected, and Daniel Reeves leaned back slightly, his fingers interlocked as he studied Naomi more carefully, while Melissa continued scrolling, explaining that the documentation also showed the transfer of authority triggered earlier that morning, and that detail created another ripple of silence, because it meant Naomi had not arrived by chance. She had arrived with timing, and Richard finally spoke again, his voice controlled but noticeably less confident, asking whether the verification process was fully completed, and Melissa nodded once, explaining that executive credentials had already validated the request and that additional confirmations were being routed through the board system in real time. And Naomi glanced briefly toward the windows, the fading sunlight reflecting softly across the glass, and for a moment she seemed distant, as if remembering something, and the memory came quietly, not spoken aloud but present in her calm expression, a younger version of herself standing in a corporate lobby years earlier beside her mother, watching executives walk past without acknowledgement, hearing whispers that leadership was not meant for someone who looked like her, and that moment had stayed with her, shaping the quiet confidence she carried now. And she returned her attention to the room as Melissa's tablet chimed softly, another notification appearing, while Daniel Reeves leaned closer again, his voice almost a whisper as he asked if the system had finalized the authorization, and Melissa nodded, her expression now fully certain as she confirmed that Naomi Carter held controlling shares under the Carter Trust effective immediately, and the silence that followed was deeper than before, because the confirmation was no longer a possibility, it was a fact, and Richard Whitmore's faint smile disappeared completely, replaced by a stillness that revealed the shift in power. While Naomi Carter remained calm at the end of the table, her hands folded once more, her presence no longer small, but quietly commanding as the room adjusted to the reality unfolding before them. No one spoke for several seconds after the confirmation settled into the room, and the silence felt different now, not uncertain but heavy with realization. While Richard Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting flat against the polished wood as if recalibrating his position, and around the table the board members shifted subtly, their posture no longer dismissive but attentive, while Daniel Reeves cleared his throat quietly, his voice measured as he acknowledged that the meeting would need to proceed under the updated authority structure, and that sentence alone signaled the shift that had just occurred, because minutes earlier Naomi had been treated like an interruption, and now the conversation was adjusting around her presence, and Naomi remained calm, her hands folded gently as she listened, her expression composed and thoughtful, while Melissa Grant continued reviewing the documents, confirming that the trust transfer had been executed at 9:30 that morning, and that Naomi's voting rights were already active within the system. And Richard glanced briefly at the digital display mounted on the wall, the time reading 4:12 in the afternoon, and the gap between those hours seemed to settle into his mind, as if realizing that Naomi had chosen this moment deliberately, and Naomi finally spoke again, her voice steady and calm as she thanked Melissa for the confirmation and requested that the meeting proceed with the agenda, and the simplicity of her tone carried quiet authority, not forceful, not dramatic, just confident, and Daniel Reeves nodded slightly, turning to the agenda on his tablet. While one of the junior board members adjusted his chair, his earlier skepticism replaced with careful respect, and the late afternoon light continued to fade, casting long reflections across the glass walls as the city below shifted into early evening. And Richard's gaze moved toward Naomi again, his expression composed but thoughtful, as if reassessing every assumption he had made minutes earlier, and Naomi's calm presence remained steady, her posture relaxed yet grounded, and for a brief moment she remembered another boardroom years ago, sitting quietly beside her grandfather, listening as executives debated decisions while she remained invisible, and afterward he had told her that true authority rarely needed to be loud, it only needed to be certain. And now that lesson settled into the room as she sat quietly at the end of the table, her presence no longer questioned, and Daniel Reeves began outlining the first item on the agenda. But the energy of the room had shifted permanently, because the teenager who had entered quietly now held the controlling authority, and every voice in the room adjusted accordingly, while Naomi Carter listened with calm focus, her quiet confidence reshaping the meeting without raising her voice. Daniel Rees began outlining the restructuring proposal, his voice steady but measured as he walked through projected numbers and timelines displayed on the large screen at the end of the boardroom. And while the discussion resumed, the tone of every response had shifted subtly, because each member now spoke with an awareness of Naomi's presence, glancing occasionally toward her before offering opinions, and Naomi listened quietly. Her posture relaxed, her hands folded lightly as she followed the conversation with calm attention, while Richard Whitmore remained silent longer than before, his gaze fixed on the presentation but his mind clearly elsewhere, recalculating the strategy he had arrived with earlier that afternoon. And when Daniel paused for feedback, Richard finally leaned forward, his voice composed but noticeably more careful as he addressed the room, suggesting adjustments to the acquisition timeline. And the suggestion was reasonable, polished, the kind of input that had once guided the room effortlessly. Yet now the attention shifted toward Naomi, and Daniel Rees glanced at her before responding, as if instinctively recognizing the new authority in the room, and Naomi lifted her eyes slightly, considering the proposal without haste, her calm demeanor making the moment feel longer than it was, and she spoke softly, asking for clarification on the projected employee retention metrics. And the question was precise, informed, and it caused several board members to glance at one another, surprised not by the question itself, but by how naturally she had stepped into the discussion, while Daniel adjusted the slide to display additional data, explaining the assumptions behind the projections, and Naomi listened, nodding slightly, her expression thoughtful, and outside the windows the sky had begun to shift into early evening, the glow of city lights slowly emerging below, and Richard watched her carefully, his earlier confidence replaced with measured respect, as he realized she was not simply present, she was engaged, and Naomi finally responded, her voice calm as she suggested revisiting the retention plan to prioritize leadership continuity, and Daniel nodded immediately, making a note, while another board member agreed, and the conversation adjusted accordingly, and in that quiet shift, the room acknowledged her influence without needing to say it directly, and Richard leaned back again, his expression thoughtful, as if recognizing that the authority had fully settled into place, and Naomi Carter remained composed at the end of the table, her presence steady, her voice calm, and the meeting continued with a new rhythm shaped quietly by the teenager who had entered unnoticed and now guided the direction of the room without raising her voice. The conversation continued with a new rhythm, quieter but more deliberate, as Daniel Rees adjusted the presentation to reflect Naomi's suggestion, and one by one the board members began contributing with careful precision, their voices measured, their attention shifting naturally toward Naomi before finalizing each point, while outside the glass walls the Chicago skyline transitioned fully into evening, the city lights flickering to life like a slow constellation beneath them, and the glow reflected softly across the polished table, casting a calm but serious tone over the room, and Richard Whitmore remained silent for several minutes, studying the revised projections, his fingers resting against the leather notebook in front of him, the earlier confidence now replaced with thoughtful calculation, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quieter respect, acknowledging Naomi's retention strategy and suggesting an additional safeguard for executive leadership transitions, and Naomi listened carefully, her eyes steady, considering his words without urgency, and she nodded slightly, acknowledging the value in the adjustment, and that simple exchange shifted the final tension that had lingered between them, because the dismissal that had once filled the room was now replaced by mutual professionalism, and Daniel Rees recorded the updates, confirming the adjustments allowed, and another board member added that the revised plan aligned better with long-term stability, and Naomi responded calmly, emphasizing that stability mattered more than rapid expansion, her voice soft but firm, and the room fell into quiet agreement, while Melissa Grant updated the documentation in real time, her tablet reflecting the revised framework, and Richard leaned back again, his posture no longer defensive, his expression composed, as he realized the meeting had moved beyond his initial expectations, and Naomi's presence had reshaped the outcome without confrontation, and for a brief moment Naomi glanced toward the city lights beyond the glass, remembering her grandfather's words about leadership, that authority was not proven by volume but by clarity. And she returned her attention to the room as Daniel summarized the final decisions, confirming that the restructuring plan would proceed under the updated authority and revised strategy. And one by one the board members nodded, the agreement settling quietly but firmly, and the meeting that had begun with skepticism now closed with calm consensus. And Naomi Carter remained seated at the end of the table, her presence steady, her quiet authority fully established. As the boardroom adjusted to a new direction shaped not by the loudest voice, but by the calmest one, the meeting settled into a quiet close as Daniel Reeves summarized the final decisions, his voice steady while the last notes were entered into the system. And one by one the board members began gathering their tablets and folders, the tension that once filled the room replaced by a calm sense of resolution, while the Chicago skyline outside glowed fully in the evening. Reflections of city lights stretching across the glass walls like a quiet reminder of the scale of what had just shifted. Inside the room, and Naomi Carter remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting lightly on the table, her expression thoughtful as she absorbed the outcome, while Richard Whitmore slowly closed his notebook and looked toward her, his posture composed, the earlier confidence now replaced with measured respect. And after a brief pause he spoke, his voice calm and professional as he acknowledged that he had underestimated her presence. And Naomi met his gaze quietly, her response gentle, but steady as she explained that leadership was not always obvious at first glance, and the simplicity of her words carried more weight than any formal statement. While Daniel Reeves glanced between them, recognizing the significance of the exchange, and Melissa Grant finalized the documentation, confirming that the decisions would be circulated to the executive team within the hour. And as chairs shifted softly across the carpeted floor, the board members began to stand, several offering Naomi respectful nods as they moved toward the door, and Naomi rose as well, her backpack